Ricardo observing the yellow lights of the restaurant.
The night was special. After years of effort, he had finally achieved the promotion he had dreamed of.
He felt on top of the world, deserving of every luxury that night gave him.
The aroma of the filet mignon being prepared in the kitchen invaded the room, making your hunger and satisfaction even more intense.
But something caught his attention.
On the other side of the window, almost hidden by the shadows of the street, a pair of eyes watched him. The boy, thin and wearing worn-out clothes, kept his gaze fixed on Ricardo, as if he could taste the dish only with his imagination.
There was something in those eyes beyond hunger, a mix of curiosity and recognition, as if fate, at that moment, was playing with both. Ricardo tried to ignore it. He was just another street kid among so many in that big city. But as the waiter brought his steaming, fragrant dish, the boy's gaze became unbearable. Something inside him bothered him, a strange feeling, as if he were about to discover something that would completely change that night.
And perhaps his life. He needed to decide, ignore that presence or give in to this impulse that was growing inside him. Little did Ricardo know that this meeting was not a simple coincidence. The story that began there had much deeper roots than he could imagine.
Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like and activate the bell.
This would ensure that you don't miss any details of this intriguing story, which will surprise you with every twist and turn. The waiter, smiling, placed the plate in front of Ricardo, whose hunger was already beginning to become unbearable. The filet mignon, rare and covered in a golden sauce, exuded an irresistible aroma.
He prepared to cut the first piece, when suddenly, a scream cut through the air, freezing the atmosphere of the restaurant. Don't eat that. Don't touch that.
The hoarse but urgent voice came from Pedro, the street boy that Ricardo had seen from afar. The boy appeared at the door of the restaurant, panting, his eyes wide as if he had run for miles.
Everyone present turned around, shocked.
The environment, which until then was full of sophistication and formality, was invaded by a feeling of discomfort and curiosity. Ricardo, surprised, looked at the boy, not knowing what to do. The security guard, noticing the movement and the potential for confusion, quickly headed towards the entrance.
Hey kid, you can't stay here.
Get out now,
He spoke in a harsh tone, extending his hand towards Pedro.
but the boy didn't move. Instead, he ran over to Ricardo, stopping just inches from his table.
I
need to warn you, Pedro said, breathing heavily, the words coming out almost like a sigh.
You don't know what you're doing.
You shouldn't eat that. Silence took over the restaurant. The waiter, who had just served the meal, looked at the two with a bewildered expression. The security guard was already close, trying to grab the boy by the arm, but Pedro seemed to ignore everything around him. He fixed his gaze on Ricardo, as if he were in a state of alert, ready for anything.
Why are you saying that? Ricardo finally asked, his voice tinged with disbelief.
He looked at the plate of steak, his appetite still present, but something in the boy's attitude made him hesitate.
What do you know about this?
Pedro took a step forward. His expression more serious than he had ever imagined.
I know what you're going to find out, and it won't be good.
The dish.
The dish is. It's poisoned.
The words came out of his mouth with tremendous weight, as if he were defying reality by saying them.
Ricardo laughed nervously, trying to convince himself that it was all just a delusion.
Poisoned?
You must be out of your mind.
This is a 5-star restaurant, and you're saying that. What exactly? That my dinner is going to kill me? He looked at the dish, the aromas still calling to him, but doubt was beginning to creep into his mind. The boy moved even closer, whispering now, almost as if he was afraid someone would hear him.
They know. They're watching you.
You've been chosen, Ricardo.
This dish isn't just food. It's a warning.
If you eat it, something will happen. Something you never expected. The security guard was already a few steps away from Pedro, ready to grab him. But before he could react, the boy turned to him and shouted, "No."
He needs to know the truth. The desperation in Pedro's voice made the security guard hesitate for a moment.
At that moment, Ricardo felt a chill down his spine.
Something was wrong.
Something much bigger than he imagined was at stake. The restaurant, until then a scene of elegance and calm, now seemed like a prison, with the customers' eyes fixed on Ricardo and Pedro.
Some whispered, others murmured, but everyone seemed to be waiting for the reaction of the man who was about to consume what appeared to be a simple meat dish. Ricardo looked back at the boy, his eyes filled with a mix of doubt and fear. Are you sure what you're saying? Ricardo asked, his voice low but firm. He wanted to believe it was all a trick.
Maybe the boy was just trying to get attention, or who knows, it was a setup. But something in his gaze seemed too genuine to ignore. Pedro, visibly exhausted, seemed to struggle to maintain his composure.
I don't have time to explain everything, but if you eat it, you're going into something there's no turning back from. They have control over what happens to you afterward. It's not just food. It's marked.
He paused, seeming to hesitate for a moment before looking directly into Ricardo's eyes. They know everything about you. They're just waiting for the right moment. The waiter, realizing the situation was getting out of control, tried to intervene.
Sir, perhaps this young man should leave. He is disturbing everyone here. Ricardo looked at the waiter, then at the boy.
The tension was palpable. What Pedro had said was strange, but something in his posture indicated that he wasn't lying. A chill ran down Ricardo's spine, and he felt a weight in his chest, as if the burden of a choice had fallen upon him. "Pedro," Ricardo began, but the boy interrupted him, pointing to the plate with a desperate expression. "Don't listen to me. Listen to your intuition. Don't eat. If you do, you'll understand what I am trying to tell you." Too late. The security guard finally grabbed Pedro by the arm, forcing him to walk away. "That's enough," he said, trying to pull him out of the restaurant. But before the boy was dragged to the door, he looked at Ricardo one last time. "Remember what I said. The truth always comes out. Don't think you're beyond their reach." Ricardo, now alone, remained silent for a few seconds. The room around him seemed to have slowed down, and the aroma of the filet mignon no longer seemed so appetizing. Ricardo's mind was spinning, and he wondered if he should trust the boy's words. After all, he was in a safe place, with high-quality food, and a promising future ahead of him. But something inside him wouldn't let him ignore the warning. He looked at his plate one last time before standing up. Without saying a word, he left the restaurant, his mind full of questions and his stomach empty. The night that was supposed to be his celebration was just beginning to reveal its true nature. Ricardo was almost out of the restaurant, his mind buzzing with Pedro's words, when a sudden impulse made him stop. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the night was far from being the simple celebratory dinner he had imagined. What Peter had said still echoed in his mind, but fear and disbelief made him hesitate. He wasn't the type to believe in conspiracy theories or warnings from strangers, but something in the boy's eyes made him think. Maybe it was the desperation in Pedro's eyes, or the strength of his words, but he needed to know more. Ricardo turned abruptly, walking back to the restaurant entrance. The security guard was still there, holding Pedro tightly, but Ricardo's look made the man stop for a moment. He raised his hand, signaling the security guard. "Wait," said Ricardo, his voice firm, but with a hint of doubt that he couldn't disguise. "Let the boy talk. I want to hear what he has to say." The security guard, apparently surprised, let out a sigh, but did not question the order.
Pedro, still panting, looked up at Ricardo, his eyes still bristling with a mixture of fear and urgency.
He looked weak, almost as if he had been running for hours, but his expression was one of determination. "Why are you shouting?" Ricardo asked, now more serious, trying to understand the situation. "What's going on here?" Pedro, breathing hard, looked around as if he was looking for something. I saw it, sir. I saw it with my own eyes. I was in the kitchen, hiding behind a door. I saw when the cook put a strange powder on your plate. It wasn't normal seasoning. I know it looked normal, but it wasn't. It wasn't food. It was something else." He looked at the plate Ricardo had left behind, a look of fear in his eyes. "They were waiting for you to eat, sir. They were waiting for the right moment."
Ricardo remained motionless, looking at Pedro as if the boy was speaking an unknown language.
He wanted to laugh. He wanted to ignore what he was hearing, but there was something in Pedro's tone that stopped him. Something that said the boy wasn't lying. "Did you see that, Pedro?"
Ricardo asked, doubt becoming more evident in his voice.
"Did you actually see someone putting something on my plate?" Pedro nodded firmly, a quick gesture. "Yes, I saw it. It was there, in the corner, in the kitchen. They were making sure you wouldn't notice." He was smiling as he put the powder on, like he knew what was going to happen. The boy seemed to lose strength with each word, but he still remained firm in his statement. "I knew something was wrong. I saw the chef earlier. He seemed strange, like he was in a trance." Ricardo swallowed hard, Pedro's words echoing in his mind. It all seemed like a nightmare. How could he believe such an absurd story?
But the intensity of the situation compelled him to listen more.
He looked at the security guard, who was still standing still, but with a look of growing doubt. "Are you sure of what you're saying, boy?"
Ricardo questioned again, looking for any sign that Pedro was lying. "Are you telling me I was poisoned?"
Pedro did respond immediately. He looked at the empty plate, his gaze becoming sadder and more resigned.
"I don't know, sir. I don't know what's on your plate, but I know it's not just food.
And if you eat it, something will happen to you."
I can't let that happen." Ricardo felt a wave of distrust take over him.
He didn't know what to think. What Peter was saying was absurd. But what if it were true? What if he was really in danger? The restaurant was renowned, and everything there seemed perfect. But Pedro's words stirred something inside him.
Something he couldn't ignore.
"Who are they?" Ricardo asked, the doubt now turning into an urgent need for answers.
"Who's trying to do this to me?" Pedro hesitated, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I don't know exactly, sir.
I'm just a kid, but I see things, I hear things."
"I know they have a network. Powerful people.
They do these things.
They use you like a pawn in a game, and you don't even know it." He looked at Ricardo with an intense expression.
"They know everything about you."
"You were chosen." Ricardo felt a shiver run down his spine.
"Chosen for what?"
He couldn't understand.
Peter was saying things that seemed impossible. Things that defied all logic he knew. Chosen to be next, Pedro replied, his voice low, almost a whisper.
They do this to everyone. They choose, and you can't escape.
No matter how hard you try.
I
I don't want you to be the next victim. Ricardo remained silent, his heart beating faster, fear beginning to take shape in his mind. What Peter was saying could have been a lie, but there was something about his speech that seemed so convincing, so urgent.
He wanted to believe that this was all a fabrication, an attempt to deceive him.
But the situation, the intensity of the conversation, and the very sight of the boy was starting to leave him feeling helpless. The security guard, who had been silent, stepped forward.
Are you going to listen to this kid? He's talking nonsense.
Should we call the police?
Ricardo did respond immediately.
He was lost in thought, trying to put the pieces of this crazy puzzle together.
Something inside him told him he couldn't just ignore the situation. He felt like he was on the verge of something much greater than a simple meal. Something that was beyond his understanding.
He looked at Peter once more. What do you want from me, boy? He asked, his voice now softer, but with a tone of urgency. What do I do now?
Pedro looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope.
You need to get out of here.
You can't stay. They're watching you, Ricardo. You have to go now, before it's too late. He paused, seeming to struggle to stay focused. I can help you, but you need to trust me. You have to believe me, or everything I said will be in vain. Ricardo looked at the boy for a few more seconds.
The decision was before him, and he knew that his life would perhaps never be the same again. He needed to trust or ignore.
It was a choice no one should have to make, but he didn't have the time anymore.
Okay, Ricardo said, finally making the decision. I'll believe you, Pedro. Let's find out what's going on. The restaurant manager, visibly disturbed by the situation, quickly approached the table where Ricardo and Pedro were.
He forced a smile, trying to diffuse the tension in the room. Sir, please. I apologize for the confusion, the manager said, his voice strained.
Let me clear everything up right away. I'll call the head chef. He can explain what happened.
There's no need to fuss. Ricardo watched carefully, his eyes still fixed on Pedro, who seemed immersed in a growing anxiety.
The manager quickly walked away, heading towards the kitchen.
Pedro, however, didn't seem willing to wait, his eyes fixed on the plate of filet mignon that was still in front of Ricardo.
This is not the time to wait, sir. The dish needs to be tested immediately, before it is too late, Pedro said, his voice shaking, but with an undeniable urgency. He took a step forward, trying to remain calm, but his look was increasingly distressed.
I can't guarantee your safety if you keep this up.
They could be watching your every move. Ricardo sat back down, his hands still restless, and looked at his plate. The food was there, apparently harmless, but what Pedro had said kept echoing in his mind.
The idea of being at risk because of a plate of food seemed insane. But the look in the boy's eyes, the way he spoke, was starting to make sense in a strange way. Pedro was so immersed in the situation, so completely involved in what he was saying, that Ricardo found himself torn between logic and the discomfort that was growing inside him. Do you really think it's necessary to test the dish? Ricardo asked it, now in a calmer voice, but still full of skepticism.
He looked at Pedro, trying to understand if the boy was really being sincere or if he was just trying to scare him. What do you mean by testing?
How can you be sure this is necessary?
Pedro took a deep breath, a heavy sigh that seemed to carry all the pain and fear he had accumulated over time.
Because I saw what happened, sir.
I saw the chef putting the powder on your plate. He was acting strange, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Pedro looked at his plate again, his eyes beginning to shine with a mixture of anguish and determination.
I know this isn't just food.
And if you eat it, everything I said will come true, and you will understand too late. Ricardo looked at Pedro once again, and his thoughts began to stir.
But you don't know what this powder is. It could be a spice or something common. We can't just jump to such drastic conclusions without knowing what we're dealing with. He felt a growing frustration.
He was trying to rationalize the situation, but a part of him was already starting to believe what Pedro was saying. The pressure was great, and the boy's words, although alarming, were hitting a sensitive nerve inside him.
Please give me a chance, Pedro begged, his voice now hoarse with tension. It's not just paranoia.
I saw the chef do this before. I've seen other people who got into this game. It's not normal.
None of this is normal.
He paused, as if searching for a way to convey what was really happening.
They know about you, sir.
You have been chosen. There is no way out. The dish you are about to eat will put you in a situation you cannot control.
They will not stop there. Ricardo felt a tight knot in his stomach. It was as if the world was disintegrating around him. How could Pedro know all that?
How was the boy so sure of what he was saying? The manager quickly returned with the chef, a burly man with a serious face.
He looked somewhat uncomfortable as he watched the scene unfolding before him.
I understand there was a misunderstanding, said the chef, trying to maintain his authoritative stance.
But I assure you, there was nothing wrong with the dish.
I prepared everything personally, and the sauce was made with the standard ingredients.
There is nothing unusual. Ricardo looked at the chef skeptically.
He wanted to believe the chef. He wanted to believe that everything was fine and that Pedro was just creating a scene, but the boy's words still hung in the air, like a warning that couldn't be ignored.
I want to see what you put on the plate now, Ricardo said, the decision forming in his mind.
He could no longer ignore what Pedro had said. The head chef looked surprised, but nodded reluctantly. He signaled to the waitress, who went to the kitchen and returned with a small plastic bowl with a sample of the sauce that had been served.
Here is the sauce that was used in the dish, said the chef, placing the bowl on the table. Ricardo took the bowl with a suspicious look.
He didn't know what to expect, but he felt the need to check if there was any strange substance there, something that could justify Peter's warning.
Pedro watched closely, breathing heavily. Test this, sir, before it's too late.
I saw the chef putting something in.
It wasn't just the common seasoning. It was something more.
I know what I saw. And it's not just food. Ricardo couldn't ignore the desperation in his voice. He asked for a glass of water and mixed the substance, carefully observing the behavior of the sample.
Something was wrong.
The water seemed to change color, becoming cloudy and viscous.
The tension grew even more, and Pedro looked at him with an almost desperate expression, as if he was waiting for Ricardo's reaction.
Do you see?
Pedro asked,
his voice low and anxious. That's the powder that the chef put on the plate.
It's not something common. It's not a substance that should be there. Ricardo swallowed hard.
He knew he was facing something much bigger than he had imagined.
He wasn't sure what exactly was happening. But now, with the substance in the cup and the change visible, Peter's words began to gain weight.
He looked at the head chef, who was observing the scene with a troubled expression.
So you confirm this is your sauce? Ricardo asked, his voice firm but full of uncertainty.
The chef hesitated for a moment.
He swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, it's the sauce.
But it could be an error, some problem with the ingredients.
I don't know what happened. The boss's expression was one of contained panic, but something in his posture indicated that he was lying, trying to keep the situation under control. I don't believe in mistakes, Ricardo said, his voice now harder, his mind beginning to piece together the puzzle.
I think you knew exactly what you were doing. He looked at Pedro, who was waiting for silent confirmation that he was on the right path. The manager, upon realizing that the situation was getting worse, raised his hands, trying to intervene once again.
Sir, please let me resolve this. There is no need to. No, Ricardo cut in, now with a voice that left no room for doubt. I need answers now.
What's going on here?
Who is behind this?
And as he faced the chef, the feeling that he was at the center of a larger conspiracy deepened, making it clear that nothing there was simple.
The game had begun, and Ricardo was about to discover how far the truth would go.
The restaurant was in a tense atmosphere. The walls seemed to close in around Ricardo as he waited for the test to arrive. The waiter who had been called to take the sauce sample to the makeshift laboratory was visibly apprehensive, his pale face reflecting the discomfort of the situation. Ricardo, with his hands shaking slightly, looked at the glass with the sample that, until a few minutes ago, seemed harmless, but now carried a weight that he could not ignore.
Pedro was at his side, with his gaze fixed on the test, as if he were watching the future unfold before his eyes.
The boy, despite his frail appearance and his age, seemed to have a deep understanding of what was happening, and his expression was no longer one of fear, but of silent relief. He had done his part, and now what happened next was beyond his control. The kitchen door opened, and the waiter returned with a small test device, accompanied by a technician who seemed as nervous as everyone else there. The man placed the device on the table, which appeared to be a rapid field test for the presence of toxic substances.
Everyone was silent, waiting.
The technician looked at the sauce sample with an expression of pure concentration, while the waiter stood still, awaiting confirmation. Ricardo swallowed hard, his mind still struggling to understand what was happening. The test should only take a few minutes, the technician said, trying to remain calm, although his voice cracked a little as he left. But please wait patiently. Ricardo couldn't look away. He was now so focused on the test that he barely noticed the growing silence around him. Even the manager and chef were tense, exchanging nervous glances.
Pedro, however, seemed at peace, as if he already knew what the test would show. He was no longer anxious, just observing with a calm that Ricardo couldn't understand. The technician fiddled with the device, pressing some buttons and waiting for the result. When the device finally beeped, everyone looked at it as if time had stopped. The test didn't lie. The result was clear. The sauce was contaminated with a toxic substance, a powerful poison that could have killed Ricardo within a few hours. if he had ingested it. Ricardo remained motionless. The words wouldn't come out of his mouth.
He looked at the device, then at Pedro, and finally at the manager, who was in a complete state of shock. This is impossible, the manager said, almost in a whisper, his face pale. How?
How did that get into the sauce?
The technician, now visibly nervous, looked at the chef, who was pale. His forehead was sweaty. That doesn't make sense.
None of our recipes should have
anything like this. What's going on here?
The technician failed to hide the confusion in his voice.
The manager was lost in thought, probably trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together, but no words were coming. I didn't put anything in the sauce. I didn't know anything about it. The chef stammered, his voice betrayed by insecurity. He looked at Peter, and in his eyes there was an almost palpable fear.
This boy, he knew, Pedro, in an unexpected act of courage, looked directly at the chef.
I told you it wasn't just food, he said with disturbing calm. I saw what you did.
It wasn't just spice. It was something much more dangerous.
And you knew it.
You knew that I knew. Ricardo, still stunned, looked at Pedro, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening.
The boy wasn't lying. He had been warned, and now he was faced with the only reason he was still alive.
Peter had seen something he could never imagine, and because of it, his life had been saved.
He looked at the empty plate in front of him, now a symbol of his luck.
The tension in the air was almost palpable.
The manager, finally regaining some of his composure, picked up the phone and made a quick call. The police.
Yes, we need help. There is poison in the sauce.
Yes, call an investigation team now. He hung up and looked at the employees who, now more nervous, began to move away from the area.
They knew something serious had happened, but no one seemed to fully understand the scope of the situation. You saved my life, Ricardo said to Pedro, still not believing what was happening.
He looked at the boy with a new respect, a look of gratitude mixed with a dose of confusion. How did you know? Pedro looked at Ricardo, his gaze now less filled with anguish, but still filled with a silent sadness. I see things. I hear things.
I'm not crazy.
I saw the chef do that before. It wasn't the first time. They're everywhere, and you were their next victim. He paused and looked at the manager, who was still trying to deal with the chaos around him.
I tried to warn you before, but no one listened to me.
I knew you were going to eat. I saw everything happen, and I couldn't let that happen. Ricardo remained silent, absorbing Pedro's words. He knew something was very wrong, but the gravity of the situation was only beginning to reveal itself.
Pedro had been the only one to notice, the only one to understand. And thanks to that he was there, alive.
Are you saying this wasn't the first time this happened?
Pedro nodded, eyes downcast, as if this were a sad and inevitable reality.
It wasn't.
And it won't be the last if no one does anything. They're too big to get caught like that. Just like that. They have power.
And they choose who gets to suffer.
You were just next on the list. Ricardo felt a chill run down his spine.
How could he know all this? How did Pedro, a street child, have this knowledge, this deep understanding of what was happening? The police arrived quickly, as they always do in situations like this, and the investigation team soon took over the restaurant.
Between questions and more questions, Ricardo was taken to a separate room, where an experienced investigator began to take his statement. Pedro was also called, but he was kept aside, under observation, as if his story were another piece in the puzzle.
Ricardo, although still processing everything that had happened, knew that Pedro's warning had saved his life. Without him, without his intervention, he would have eaten that dish, and the story would have ended very differently. Do you believe me now? Pedro asked later, while sitting in a chair, awaiting the investigation. His tone was soft, but the sincerity in his words left no room for doubt. Ricardo took a deep breath, still in shock, but with a gratitude he didn't know how to express. I don't know how you knew, but yes, I believe you now. He looked at Pedro, his eyes more attentive, more aware that he had before him someone who had not only been the victim of a cruel world, but also someone who, somehow, had the power to see what others could not.
You saved me, Pedro.
I'll never forget that. Pedro gave a small but genuine smile, as if he had finally made a difference. I know. No need to thank me, sir.
I just wanted to help, but it's nice to know someone actually listened. He looked at the ground, and for a moment, Ricardo realized that there was much more to this story than he imagined. But for now, he only had one thing on his mind. He was alive, thanks to Pedro. The police investigation was progressing quickly and steadily, but Ricardo's mind was still distant, full of doubts and uncertainties. He tried to understand how it all happened, how he had been chosen to be the victim of something so calculated, and how Pedro, a street boy, had become his only hope.
He was still trying to digest the fact that his life had narrowly been taken by someone inside the restaurant, where he had thought himself safe.
Detectives had been at the restaurant for hours, investigating every corner, examining security cameras and questioning employees.
What initially seemed like a simple case of kitchen error or an isolated incident soon turned out to be something much more complex. The poisoning had not been an accident, as everyone had initially thought.
Someone in the restaurant had deliberately acted to harm Ricardo. I still can't believe what's happening, Ricardo said to the chief detective, a burly man named Martins, as they sat in the restaurant's conference room.
I work with these people every day. I saw those faces all the time.
How could anyone there try to do that to me?
Detective Martins stared at him, his face hardened by the gravity of the situation.
We found some clues that could explain this, Ricardo.
And the shocking thing is that it appears you weren't the only target.
You were just next in line.
But there is something even more complicated. The cook who prepared your dish seems like he has a personal feud with you. Ricardo blinked, trying to process the revelation.
A feud? I can't imagine who it would be.
I don't know many of the cooks here personally. How could this affect my plate? Martins paused and pulled out some papers from the briefcase he was carrying. He placed them on the table in front of Ricardo.
Here's what we found.
The cook who prepared your dish, a certain Vencias, has a history of disagreements with you.
He worked with you on a few occasions, and according to sources, you had a fight with him over work-related issues.
The problem is that he couldn't overcome this hurt.
And apparently that led to something much more serious. Ricardo felt an ice run down his spine.
He remembered Vencias, the closed-looking cook, who always seemed to disagree with anything Ricardo suggested at work. Nothing seemed more than a simple, everyday frustration. But now it took on another dimension. He had never imagined that Vencias had something so profound against him. Something that was capable of turning him into such a dangerous enemy. That doesn't make sense, Ricardo said, his voice barely above a whisper.
I never imagined he was capable of something like this. He never showed signs that he would be so angry with me. Martins leaned forward, his gaze serious.
Sometimes anger disguises itself in many forms.
The investigation leaves no doubt. The poison found on your plate is not something that is added by mistake.
It was placed intentionally, and the motivation seems clear.
He knew what he was doing. Ricardo was silent for a moment, the revelation falling on him like an immense weight. So he tried to kill me because I had a fight with him.
Disbelief was visible on his face.
I can't believe that someone I never suspected would try to do something so terrible. Detective Martins made a serious expression. Unfortunately, this is the reality. And the most dangerous thing is that he knew exactly how to act to avoid any suspicion. If it weren't for Pedro, you wouldn't have survived to tell this story. Pedro, who until that moment had remained silent, now entered the conversation with a serious look, as if he was waiting for that moment of revelation. I knew something wasn't right with the chef.
When I saw him doing that thing with the sauce, I knew it was too late. You, sir, would not have survived. Not without my intervention. Ricardo looked at Pedro, still without words to express all the gratitude he felt.
You saved my life, Pedro. I don't even know how to thank you. Pedro made a gesture of humility, as if that were the most natural thing in the world.
No need to thank me.
I just did what I knew was right. Someone had to do something, and I was the only one who noticed. They can't hide it anymore. If it weren't for you, sir, no one would know what was going on there. Detective Martins stood up, gesturing for Ricardo and Pedro to follow him to the room where the other investigators were gathered. We are going to take an important step now.
The cook Vencias is being arrested right now. He has already been interrogated, and there was no way to deny his participation.
The poison he used is lethal and was completely disguised in the sauce.
It seems that he prepared everything very carefully, hoping that you wouldn't notice until it was too late. Ricardo took a deep breath, still trying to absorb everything.
He couldn't believe that someone on his own team had been capable of something so extreme.
He looked at Pedro's face, still with an expression of silent confidence.
Pedro had acted quickly, without hesitation, and it was thanks to that he was alive. However, he couldn't help but wonder how much more he didn't know about what went on inside that restaurant, and what else the future held for him.
I always thought work was just a matter of doing your best and moving forward, Ricardo said, his voice tense.
I never imagined that someone so close to me would be capable of harming me.
Now, this changes everything. Martins, with an expression of understanding, made an affirmative gesture.
Unfortunately, Ricardo, in high-pressure environments, things are not always what they seem.
But you now know that, for once, you were lucky. And luck, in this case, came in the form of a boy you never imagined would make such a difference. The restaurant manager, who was now following the investigation, looked at Ricardo with a look of concern. I'm sorry, Ricardo.
I didn't know anything about it. If I had
realized something, maybe this wouldn't have happened. I will personally ensure that the restaurant is completely overhauled. That will never happen here again. Ricardo nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He no longer trusted the environment around him. The betrayal had come from within, from someone with whom he shared a daily work environment. The fear that other betrayals could be taking place without him realizing it haunted him. However, one thing was clear in his mind. Pedro, the street boy no one believed in anymore, was the only one who had acted with courage, and that courage, however unlikely it was, had been the key to his survival.
Vanxius, the cook, was arrested shortly after the discovery. The police found enough evidence to incriminate him, and he was taken to a cell where he would await trial.
The restaurant, which was temporarily closed for a complete review of its security procedures, began to face the consequences of an internal crime that had been carefully planned. Ricardo, still in shock, thanked Pedro one last time before leaving the room. You have no idea how grateful I am.
You saved me, and no one will ever take that away from me. Pedro smiled slightly, his gaze silent but firm.
I knew you would understand. With that, the weight of this situation began to dissipate a little, but the trauma would remain with Ricardo for a long time. The truth was, in a world where he believed he was just another employee, a lie, a personal feud, and poison could change the course of his life, and he would never forget the boy who, instead of being ignored, decided to take action and ensure he had a future.
Ricardo didn't know what to say to Pedro. Although he had tried to express his gratitude in every way he could, nothing seemed enough.
That boy, who until then had lived on the margins of society, had been responsible for saving his life. He remembered how Pedro didn't hesitate, how he intervened without thinking about the consequences, simply because he wanted to do the right thing.
Ricardo knew that his luck had been pure coincidence, but he also understood that Pedro could not simply be ignored, left behind.
It was the least he could do. After leaving the police station and following Vanxius' arrest, Ricardo sat in his room, his eyes fixed on the window.
He was thinking about what to do with Pedro.
The boy was now free, but his future seemed uncertain. Future that until then seemed very difficult to achieve.
He knew that Pedro didn't have anyone's support, that his life on the streets had robbed him of any possibility of a fresh start.
But now, Pedro had the chance he deserved. That night, when Pedro was released from the police station and found Ricardo waiting for him, the boy seemed more relaxed, but still suspicious, as if he didn't know what tomorrow would bring.
Pedro, said Ricardo, with a soft tone, trying to convey sincerity. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life, and that means more than I can express. Pedro looked up at him, a curious gleam in his tired eyes. But there was something else there. I just did what I thought had to be done.
I didn't need to thank you. Ricardo gave a slight smile, but there was a weight in his voice.
I know you think you did the right thing, but the truth is you gave me something I couldn't have bought. You gave me a chance to continue living.
And so I want to give you a chance too. Pedro looked at him, confused. What do you mean?
Ricardo took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully.
I want you to come live with me, Pedro.
I have space. I want to help you.
I want you to have a better life, to be able to study, to have something beyond the streets.
You deserve better. Pedro was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ground.
He seemed to absorb what was being said, as if he had never considered the possibility of a future of the street. He had always lived on the margins, always found himself alone in the world.
The offer seemed like a distant dream, something that wasn't for him.
But when looking at Ricardo, something changed. He saw there not only the gratitude of a man who had been saved, but the glimpse of a true opportunity. Would you do that for me?
Pedro asked, his voice low, almost incredulous. Ricardo nodded, with a sincerity that left no room for doubt. Yes, Pedro.
I will do it. I promise to pay for your studies, to help you find a new path. I know this won't be easy, but if you want, I will be by your side. Ricardo's words remained in the air, like a silent promise. Pedro looked in shock, his eyes wide and a slight tension on his face. He didn't know how to react, didn't know if he should believe what was being offered, but the gleam of hope in his eyes said a lot.
I don't know how to accept this, Pedro said, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to do with all this. I only know how to live on the streets. I only know how to fend for myself. Ricardo, with a gentle smile, approached and placed a hand on Pedro's shoulder.
I know, and it's going to be hard,
but you won't be alone.
I'll be here, and you'll see, things can be different. Life doesn't have to be like this. Peter was still in disbelief, but he felt something he had never felt before, a thread of hope, as fragile as a flame, but something that could grow. He looked at Ricardo, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think that maybe there was something more waiting for him.
In the following days, Ricardo fulfilled his promise. Pedro went to live in his house, with a comfortable room and everything he needed to start a new life.
At first, Pedro had difficulty adapting. He wasn't used to the routine of a home, the rules of coexistence, the comfort.
But over time, he learned.
Every day, he showed more gratitude to Ricardo, and at the same time, he began to understand that perhaps the world he imagined was unreachable wasn't so far away after all. Ricardo, in turn, watched Pedro with an attentive look.
He watched the boy struggle to adjust, to learn to trust his new surroundings. I knew the road would be long and full of challenges.
It wouldn't be simple for Pedro to leave the street life, difficulties and suspicions behind.
But he believed in the boy's potential. I knew he had a strength within him that, if channeled in the right way, could take him far.
The whole town had heard about the incident at the restaurant, the story of Pedro, the street boy who saved a man's life and gained a new chance, spread quickly. Social media was full of posts and videos about Pedro's courage, and many began to see him as a symbol of redemption. Even journalists began to contact Ricardo, asking to tell the story of the boy who changed everything in a single moment. You knew that your story will inspire a lot of people, didn't you?
Ricardo said to Pedro while they were having breakfast together one morning. A lot of people will look at you and think that maybe you can change their lives too.
You have no idea how many people needed to hear something like that. Pedro looked at him, but there was a certain embarrassment in his eyes.
He still wasn't used to being the center of attention, but he couldn't deny that something inside him had changed.
I never thought I could be someone who inspired people, he said, with a shy smile.
I just did what I thought needed to be done, and that's exactly what makes you special, replied Ricardo.
It wasn't what you did, it was why you did it. You didn't think twice about helping me, and that's something everyone needs to see. As the months passed, Pedro began to adapt more and more. He began to study with dedication, taking advantage of the opportunities that Ricardo gave him. He began to find interest in new things, to dream of a future he had never imagined.
He signed up for gastronomy courses, always remembering what he had experienced before, what he had learned on the streets.
But now, he had something much more valuable than any learning he had hoped. Ricardo, watching Pedro flourish, felt a pride he couldn't describe.
He knew that the boy still had a lot to learn, but he also knew that he was on the right path.
When Pedro finally completed his first year of studies and started working part-time in a restaurant, he felt that his life was finally starting to have a purpose. The boy who had been invisible to the world was now carving his own destiny.
What Pedro didn't know was that his story would inspire many others. He was no longer just the street kid.
He was a symbol of how, even in the most difficult circumstances, it is possible to start over. The boy who saved a life had found his own, and in doing so, he changed the lives of many others. And while Pedro moved on, chasing his own dreams, Ricardo knew he had done the right thing. He had given a chance to someone who was perhaps one of the most valuable people he would ever have the privilege of meeting. And so, we come to the end of this video.
If you liked the story, don't forget to like and share with your friends.
Subscribe to the channel for more content like this and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Until next time.